The wind sliced like a blade down the narrow alley. It found every tear in Elara's thin coat, every worn patch in her jeans, a cold that went deeper than skin. It settled in her bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the hollowness in her chest. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the pavement slick and treacherous, reflecting the city's indifferent neon glow. Each puddle was a distorted mirror of a sky she couldn't see. She leaned against the cold, damp brick of a building that had long since been forgotten. The rough texture scraped against her shoulder, a small, sharp pain in a sea of numbness. It was over. The thought wasn't a dramatic crash, but a dull, quiet whisper that had been growing louder for weeks. Today, it had finally become a roar. The manager at the diner hadn't even looked her in the eye. "We have to make cuts, Elara. Business is slow." The words were a script, worn and meaningless. She had nodded, unable to form a response. Her throat had closed up, tight with a scream that had nowhere to go. She had simply turned and walked out, the smell of stale coffee and grease clinging to her like a shroud. 2 months behind on rent. The landlord's face, pinched and impatient, floated in her mind. His last warning had been anything but gentle. Now she had nothing, not a single dollar to offer him. The little cash she'd had was gone, spent on cough medicine for Leo, her son. Just thinking his name was a physical blow. It cracked through the numbness, letting the terror flood in. He was only 6. His small face, pale with fever, was the only image that kept her standing. He was asleep back in their tiny, cold apartment, under the care of their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who had offered a few hours of her time out of pity. Pity was a currency Elara had grown used to, and she hated it. She had promised Leo a proper dinner, a warm one. She'd smiled, her face feeling like a porcelain mask about to shatter. "Something special, sweetie." He had smiled back, a weak but trusting smile that broke her heart all over again. Now, the reality of that promise mocked her. The refrigerator held half a carton of milk and a single, withered apple. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. It wasn't hunger for herself. She hadn't felt true hunger in days. It was the hunger of a mother who could not provide. A primal, soul-deep failure. She pushed herself off the wall, her legs trembling with cold and exhaustion. She had to do something, anything. But the city was a fortress of closed doors and averted eyes. She was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's bright, warm lives. The memory of another man's face surfaced, unbidden. Mark. His smile that never reached his eyes, the chilling softness of his voice right before the anger came. "You're nothing without me, Elara. Absolutely nothing." She had believed him for so long. Running away with Leo had been the only act of courage in her life, and she felt that courage draining out of her now, seeping into the damp concrete. Maybe he was right. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to banish his voice. She had to be strong for Leo. She had to. Her gaze fell to the ground, following a crack in the pavement. And then she saw it. Lying half in a shallow puddle was a wallet. It was thick, made of rich, black leather that gleamed even in the dim light. It didn't belong here. This was a place of discarded things, of trash and decay. This wallet was from another world. Her breath caught. She glanced around. The alley was empty. The street beyond was a blur of passing headlights. No one. Her hand trembled as she reached down, her fingers closing around the cool, damp leather. It felt heavy, solid, real. With trembling fingers, she opened it. The first thing she saw was money. A thick stack of $100 bills. More money than she had seen in her entire life. Enough to pay the rent for 6 months. Enough for groceries, for new shoes for Leo, for a coat that actually kept out the wind. Enough to breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat. This was it. An answer. A miracle born of desperation. Take it. The thought was sharp, seductive. No one would ever know. It was a lifeline, dropped at her feet from an uncaring sky. But then her fingers brushed against a plastic card. She pulled it out. A driver's license. A man's face stared back at her. He had a strong jaw, kind eyes, and a serious expression. The name read Julian Vance. Beneath it, an address. Not a home address, but a corporate one. Vance Industries. The name was familiar. One of the biggest corporations in the city. He was a CEO, a billionaire according to the city's gossip columns she sometimes glimpsed at newsstands. This money was nothing to him, a rounding error. To her, it was everything. She closed the wallet, the thick wad of cash a palpable weight in her hand. She thought of Leo's trusting smile. She thought of the eviction notice that was surely coming. But then she thought of the man in the picture. He had a family, probably, a life. He had worked for this. And what would she be teaching Leo if she took it? That desperation was an excuse for dishonesty? That their survival was worth someone else's loss? The values her own mother had instilled in her before the world had worn her down rose up like a quiet but unshakable wall. Honesty, integrity, words that felt like luxuries she could no longer afford. And yet, she couldn't do it. The momentary relief the money offered would be followed by a lifetime of shame. She would see theft in her own reflection, and worse, she would fear seeing it in her son's eyes. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like a final surrender, she made her choice. She clutched the wallet tightly and started walking. The address wasn't far. A towering skyscraper of glass and steel that scraped the clouds. It was a monument to a world she would never be a part of. The lobby was vast and silent, a cathedral of marble and chrome. A stern-looking security guard stood behind a polished desk. Elara approached, feeling small and out of place. Her damp clothes, her worn-out shoes, her very presence felt like a stain on the pristine environment. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The guard looked her up and down, his expression a mixture of suspicion and disdain. "I found this. Outside." She held out the wallet. He took it from her, handling it as if she might have contaminated it. He opened it, his eyes widening slightly at the contents. He looked back at her, his suspicion deepening. "You're just giving it back?" "It belongs to Mr. Vance," she said, pointing a trembling finger at the ID. "Please, make sure he gets it." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and fled, pushing back out into the cold night, leaving the warmth and the light behind. She didn't give her name. She didn't want thanks. She just wanted to disappear. Up on the 50th floor, Julian Vance stared out at the glittering cityscape. The lights were like a galaxy of fallen stars, but they offered him no comfort. He was the master of this empire, a king in a glass castle, and he was profoundly alone. The boardroom was empty now, the lingering scent of coffee and tension, the only evidence of the grueling meeting that had just ended. He ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion not just physical, but soul deep. It had been 2 years since the accident, 2 years since Sarah's laughter had last filled their home, 2 years since his world had lost its color. All he had left was his work and his son. Leo. His heart ached. His son was a ghost in their own home, a silent, watchful little boy who had built a wall of grief around his heart that Julian couldn't seem to breach. A knock on his office door startled him. "Mr. Vance?" It was the head of his security team, a man named Henderson. "What is it, George?" "You, seem to have lost your wallet, sir." Julian frowned, patting his jacket pocket. Empty. He must have dropped it getting out of the car. Henderson placed the familiar black leather wallet on his desk. "A woman found it, brought it to the front desk not 10 minutes ago." Julian picked it up, checking the contents out of habit. The cash, all of it, the cards, everything was there. He looked at Henderson, surprised. "Did she leave a name?" "No, sir. She just left. Seemed to be in a hurry." Julian was intrigued. In his world, acts of simple, unrewarded decency were rare. "Do we have her on camera?" "Yes, sir. I've already pulled the footage." Henderson tapped a tablet and an image appeared on the screen. A woman. Thin, soaked from the rain, her hair plastered to her face. She was wearing a coat that looked 2 sizes too big and hopelessly inadequate. But it was her face that held him. The exhaustion was plain to see. The defeat, the deep, settled sadness in her eyes. And yet there was something else, a flicker of determination, an undeniable honesty in her posture as she handed the wallet over. She looked like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. And she had returned a wallet containing more than a month's salary for most people without a moment's hesitation. A strange feeling washed over him, a deep, resonant respect, and something more, a pull, a need to understand. "Find her, George," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Sir, I want to thank her, properly. Use whatever resources you need. Find her." The next morning dawned gray and merciless. Elara awoke to the sound of a sharp, insistent rapping on her apartment door. Her heart leaped into her throat. The landlord. She crept to the door, her body rigid with fear. She peered through the peephole. There was no one there. Confused, she opened the door a crack. A piece of paper was taped to the wood, an official notice. Her eyes scanned the bold, black letters. Eviction. Notice. The words blurred. The paper felt like ice in her hands. 3 days. She had 3 days to vacate the premises. A sob tore from her throat, raw and ragged. She slid down the door, landing in a heap on the floor, the paper crumpled in her fist. It was the final blow, the end of the line. She was going to be homeless, with a sick child. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth, consumed by a wave of despair so powerful it threatened to drown her. She had failed. Mark was right. She was nothing. A gentle knock on the door made her flinch. "Go away," she choked out. The knock came again, softer this time. "Miss, are you all right in there?" The voice was deep, calm, and unfamiliar. It wasn't the landlord. Wiping her tears with the back of her hand, she pulled herself to her feet, her body aching. She opened the door again, ready to tell whoever it was to leave her alone. And then she froze. It was him, the man from the driver's license, Julian Vance. He stood in the dim, grimy hallway of her apartment building, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that cost more than everything she owned combined. He looked utterly out of place, yet his presence wasn't intimidating. His kind eyes, the same ones from the picture, were filled with a quiet concern. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the eviction notice still taped to her door. He looked from the notice to her tear-streaked face, to the crumpled paper in her hand. A long moment of silence passed between them. He finally met her eyes, and his expression was something she couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity, it was awe. "You returned my wallet," he said, his voice soft. "You returned my wallet when you had this hanging on your door." Elara couldn't speak. She just stared at him, shame and confusion warring within her. "I came to thank you," he continued gently. "But it seems a simple thank you isn't enough." She finally found her voice, though it was brittle. "I don't want your money." It was a foolish, prideful thing to say when she was drowning, but the words came out anyway. He nodded as if he had expected it. "I'm not offering money. I'm offering a job." She blinked. "A job?" "I understand you have experience with childcare," he said, his tone professional but kind. "My son, he needs someone, a companion, a housekeeper. It's a live-in position, all expenses paid, a good salary." He was framing it as a transaction, a business proposal. But she knew what it was. It was Charity, dressed up in a suit. And yet, she looked past him, down the hallway that led to a dead end. She thought of Leo, sleeping in the other room, his breathing still shallow. She had no other options. This man was offering her a lifeboat. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. Survival was not. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of despair. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Julian Vance looked at her, and for a second she saw a flash of his own deep sadness. "Because people who do the right thing when it's the hardest thing to do, they deserve a safe place to land. My son needs help. It seems you do too. Maybe we can help each other." She looked at his outstretched hand, not a hand asking for anything, but one offering a foundation. She nodded, a single, jerky movement. "Okay," she breathed. The drive to his home was a silent blur. Elara sat in the plush leather seat of his car, her own son, Leo, sleeping soundly beside her, his head resting on her lap. She stared out the window as the landscape of her life changed in an instant. The crumbling brick and graffiti of her neighborhood gave way to manicured lawns and sprawling estates. They passed through a set of imposing iron gates and drove up a long, winding driveway. The house. It wasn't a house. It was a mansion, a modern palace of glass and stone that seemed both beautiful and impossibly lonely. Julian led them inside. The interior was even more breathtaking. Soaring ceilings, polished floors, and vast windows that overlooked a perfectly landscaped garden. But it was silent. The air was still and cold. It felt like a museum, not a home. Every surface was spotless, every object perfectly placed. There was no clutter, no sign of life. A small boy appeared at the top of a sweeping staircase. He was the mirror image of Julian, with the same serious eyes and dark hair. He just stood there, watching them, his small hands clutching the railing. He didn't speak. "Leo, come down," Julian said gently. "This is Elara, and her son, also named Leo." The boy, Leo Vance, walked down the stairs slowly, his eyes never leaving Elara. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze wary and guarded. He looked like a little soldier guarding a fortress of grief. Elara's Leo, now awake, hid behind her leg, peeking out shyly. "Hello, Leo?" Elara said softly to Julian's son. "It's very nice to meet you." Leo Vance didn't reply. He just stared, his expression unreadable. Julian showed them to their rooms, a comfortable suite in a separate wing of the house. It was larger than their entire old apartment. It was beautiful, safe, and warm, and Elara felt like an intruder. She felt the immense, terrifying weight of his kindness. She was a fraud, undeserving of this sanctuary. The first few days were quiet and tense. Elara moved through the enormous house like a shadow. She cleaned with a meticulous, silent efficiency. She cooked simple, warm things. Soup that simmered for hours. Bread that baked and filled the sterile air with the scent of home. She didn't push. She didn't pry. She respected the silence that blanketed the house. Julian's son, Leo, remained a mystery. He would watch her from a distance, his eyes following her every move. If she spoke to him, he would give a small, almost imperceptible nod, but never a word. Her own son was her anchor. His cheerful chatter, though subdued in the vast quiet, was a reminder of the life she was fighting for. One afternoon, Elara was reading a story to her Leo in their sitting room. She kept the door slightly ajar. She read with all the voices and expression she could muster, pouring her love for her son into the silly tale of a bear who lost his hat. She was aware of a small presence in the hallway, Leo Vance. He was standing just out of sight, listening. She didn't acknowledge him. She just kept reading, her voice warm and steady. The breakthrough came a week later. It was small, almost unnoticeable. She was in the large, sun-filled family room when she saw Leo Vance at a table, surrounded by the pieces of a complex model airplane. His small face was tight with frustration. A tiny, delicate piece of the wing wouldn't fit. He made a small, frustrated sound, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. Elara hesitated. She remembered her own father, a man of few words but gentle hands, showing her how to build a kite. The memory was a soft, warm glow from a life long past. She walked over to the table, quietly. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you have to turn it just so." He flinched, startled by her sudden presence. She didn't reach for the model. She simply pointed with her finger. "That little notch there, it has to line up with the groove on the other piece. Try flipping it over." He stared at her for a long moment, his guarded eyes searching her face. Then he looked down at the piece. Slowly, he picked it up, flipped it over, and slid it into place. It clicked perfectly. He looked at the fitted piece, then back up at her. A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, relief. He didn't say, "Thank you," but he didn't have to. Elara gave him a small, gentle smile and walked away, leaving him to his project. Later that night, when she went to bed, she found it. Lying on her pillow was a piece of paper. On it, drawn in clumsy, childish crayon, was a picture of an airplane. Tears pricked her eyes as she picked it up. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a key, a small, crayon-drawn key to the lock on a little boy's heart. Julian saw it all. He saw the way the scent of baking bread had started to permeate the cold marble of his home. He saw the way his son, his quiet, lost son, had started to leave his room more often. He heard the faint sound of Elara's voice reading stories, a gentle melody in the oppressive silence. And he saw the drawing of the airplane, which his son had never shown him. He watched Elara when she didn't think anyone was looking. He saw the way she would pause while dusting a photograph of his late wife, her expression not one of jealousy, but of a quiet, sad respect. He saw the innate kindness in her, a gentleness that seemed to radiate from her very core, despite the world having shown her none. He found himself looking forward to coming home from work, a feeling he hadn't had in 2 years. He was drawn to her quiet strength, her unyielding resilience. She was like a wildflower that had somehow managed to bloom in the cracks of a concrete sidewalk. One night, sleep was an impossibility. The ghosts of his past were too loud. The memory of sirens, of twisting metal, of a life extinguished in an instant. He went downstairs, seeking a distraction in the cavernous kitchen. The light was already on. Elara was sitting at the large kitchen island, a mug of tea cradled in her hands, staring out at the dark garden. She looked up, startled, as he entered. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to get up. "I couldn't sleep." "No, please, stay." His voice was softer than he intended. "Neither could I." He poured himself a glass of water and sat down opposite her. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy with unspoken things. "He's been better," Julian said quietly, breaking the stillness. "My Leo. He's lighter." Elara looked down at her mug. "He's a wonderful boy. He's just been carrying a lot." "I haven't been able to reach him," Julian confessed, the words tasting like failure. "Since his mother, since the accident. It's like he's in a glass box, and I'm on the outside, pounding on the walls." He looked at her, his polished CEO veneer stripped away, leaving only a grieving husband and a terrified father. "I feel like I'm failing him." The raw vulnerability in his voice unlocked something in Elara. It gave her the courage to be vulnerable in return. "You're not failing him," she said softly. "You're grieving. You can't pour from an empty cup." She took a shaky breath. "I know about being empty." And then, in the quiet, sterile kitchen, under the soft glow of the under-cabinet lighting, she told him. She told him about Mark, about the love that had turned to control, the control that had turned to fear. She spoke of the walking on eggshells, the constant anxiety, the way he had stripped away her confidence, her friends, her very sense of self, piece by painful piece. She told him why she had run, with nothing but a small bag and her son, driven by the primal need to protect Leo from the shadow of his father's rage. "He told me I was worthless," she finished, her voice a near whisper. "For the longest time, I believed him. Sometimes, I still do." Julian listened, his expression unchanging, but his eyes were full of a deep, profound empathy. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her she was strong. He simply shared his own brokenness. "Sarah, my wife," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the light, in every room, in my life. The accident. I was driving. It wasn't my fault, they said. A drunk driver ran a red light, but I was the one who walked away. She didn't." A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. This house, this life, it all feels like a monument to her, and I'm just a ghost haunting it. I've been so lost in my own grief, I forgot that my son is lost too. They sat there in the shared darkness, two wounded souls who had shown each other their deepest scars. They were no longer just an employer and an employee. They were two people who understood each other's pain without needing to explain it. In that moment, a bond was forged, stronger than gratitude, deeper than respect. It was the quiet, tentative beginning of hope. The weeks that followed were filled with a fragile peace. The two Leos, once wary strangers, were now inseparable. Their laughter became the new soundtrack of the mansion, chasing away the last of the ghostly silence. Elara found herself smiling without thinking about it. She felt a sense of belonging that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She was beginning to feel safe, and safety was a feeling she had long since forgotten. The blow came, as it always did, without warning. Julian was in a board meeting when his phone buzzed with an urgent message from his PR director. He glanced at the screen. It was a link to a tabloid website. The headline screamed at him in bold, lurid letters. Homeless woman Cinderella scam. How a cunning vagrant seduced grieving billionaire Julian Vance. His blood ran cold. Beneath the headline was a picture. A candid, long-lens shot of him at a recent children's charity gala he had reluctantly attended. And in the background, talking to the two boys, was Elara. The article was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It painted Elara as a conniving gold digger who had orchestrated the entire wallet incident. It twisted her poverty into a weapon, her desperation into a scheme. And then came the final, devastating paragraph. Sources close to her troubled past reveal a history of instability, alleging that she fled a previous relationship under a dark cloud, with an ex-boyfriend, Mark Renshaw, still concerned for her welfare. Mark? Julian's hands clenched into fists. He knew, with absolute certainty. Who was behind this? Elara saw it on the housekeeper's tablet. She had been tidying the kitchen when she glanced at the screen left open on the counter. Her own face stared back at her. The headline slammed into her with the force of a physical assault. The air left her lungs. The room tilted, the sounds of the house fading into a dull roar in her ears. Scam, vagrant, seduction, and Mark's name. He had found her. The safety she had begun to cherish was an illusion. It shattered into a million pieces. The terror was immediate, absolute, and sickeningly familiar. It was the old fear, the one that had lived in her bones for years. She was poison. She had brought her tainted past into this good, safe place. She was going to ruin Julian, just as Mark had always said she ruined everything. She had to run. It was the only thing she knew how to do. Her movements were frantic, automated by pure panic. She ran to her room, pulling out the single, worn bag she had arrived with. She threw in her few clothes, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp the fabric. She had to protect them. She had to protect Julian and his son from her. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision as she scribbled a note. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Thank you for everything." She grabbed her sleeping son from his bed, wrapping him in a blanket. She was halfway down the main staircase when Julian's car screeched to a halt in the driveway. He burst through the front door, his face a mask of controlled fury. And then he saw her, on the stairs, with a bag in one hand and her child in her arms, a hunted look in her eyes. The fury on his face melted away, replaced by a deep, heart-wrenching pain. "Elara," he breathed. "I have to go," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I can't. I won't let him destroy you. I'm so sorry." She tried to move past him, to flee into the night. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He gently took the bag from her hand and set it on the floor. "No," he said, his voice low and unshakable. "You are not leaving." "You don't understand," she cried. "He will ruin you. He'll use me to tear you down." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective light she had never seen before. This was not just the gentle, grieving man from the kitchen. This was the titan of industry, the protector. "Let him try," Julian said, his voice ringing with power. "You are not poison, Elara. You are the best, most decent person I have ever met. This is your home now, and I protect my home. I protect my family." Family. The word hung in the air between them, a declaration that changed everything. The next morning, Julian Vance called a press conference. The room was a frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions. The world was watching, expecting him to issue a carefully worded statement distancing himself from the scandal. He walked to the podium, calm and resolute. He didn't look at his notes. He looked directly into the cameras, into the eyes of the world. "I'm not here today to talk about corporate earnings or market projections," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I'm here to talk about integrity." A hush fell over the room. "You have all read the story published yesterday, a story designed to hurt and defame a good and honorable woman. I am here to tell you the truth." He told them about the wallet. He described finding a woman, soaked and cold, who possessed nothing, yet returned everything. "That woman is Elara Miller," he declared. "She is a person of more character and integrity in her little finger than the publishers of that paper have in their entire organization." He didn't reveal the details of her past trauma. He protected her scars, but he defended her fiercely. "She and her son came into my home because I needed them. My son and we were living in a silent, gray world. Elara and her son brought the color back. They brought back the light." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "As for the source of this story, Mr. Mark Renshaw, my legal team has already uncovered his documented history of domestic abuse and harassment. We will be providing this information to the relevant authorities." A gasp went through the crowd. "Finally," Julian said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, more powerful. "Let me be unequivocally clear. I am suing the publication that ran this vile story for defamation, and I will use the full, unyielding extent of my resources to protect my family from any and all threats." He looked straight into the main camera, as if speaking directly to Elara, who was watching from home, her heart in her throat. "Elara Miller and her son are my family, and I will not allow anyone to harm them. Ever." He turned and walked off the stage, leaving a stunned and silent room in his wake. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Faced with Julian's immense legal power and the damning evidence against Mark, the tabloid crumbled. They printed a full front-page retraction and a public apology. Mark Renshaw, exposed and facing legal charges, vanished back into the shadows from which he came. The threat was neutralized. Elara was free, truly, finally free. She had watched Julian on that stage, not as a victim cowering in the shadows, but as a woman being championed. He hadn't saved her. He had stood beside her and shown her how to save herself. He had given her the ground on which to stand and fight. The fear that had been her constant companion for years finally began to recede, replaced by a feeling she barely recognized. Strength, her own. The house was no longer a house. It was a home. The silence was gone, replaced forever by the sound of two boys chasing each other through the halls, their joyous shouts echoing off the walls. The cold, sterile spaces were now filled with warmth, with scattered toys, with crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, with life. One perfect evening. As the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Julian found Elara in the garden. She was watching the two Leos, who were working together to build a lopsided but ambitious fort out of blankets and chairs. Their heads were bent close together, whispering and giggling. They were brothers, in everything but name. Elara turned as Julian approached, a soft, genuine smile on her face. The haunted look was gone from her eyes. In its place was a serene, radiant light. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to her, took her hand, and got down on one knee in the soft grass. Her breath caught. He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes, all his power and wealth meaningless in the face of this one. Profound emotion. "Elara," he began, his voice thick with feeling. "You and Leo didn't just bring the light back into this house. You brought it back into my life. You rebuilt me from the broken pieces I was." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I don't want to be your employer anymore. I don't want to be your protector. I want to be your partner, your husband." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, but he didn't open it yet. "Will you and your son do me the honor of officially becoming my family? Elara Miller, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Before she could find the words to answer, a small voice piped up. "Say yes, Elara." It was Leo Vance. He and Elara's son had abandoned their fort and run over. "Say yes," Julian's son urged, his eyes shining with an excitement Elara had never seen in him before. "Then we can be brothers for real, and you can be my mom." Her own Leo nodded eagerly, throwing his arms around Julian's leg in a gesture of pure, unconditional acceptance. Elara looked from the hopeful faces of the two boys to the face of the man kneeling before her, the man who had seen her at her lowest and lifted her up not out of pity, but out of respect. She was no longer the broken woman in the alley. She was whole. "Yes," she whispered, the word a prayer of thanks. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Their wedding was not a grand society affair. There were no cameras, no reporters, no crowds. It took place on a sun-drenched afternoon in the garden they had come to love, the same garden where he had proposed. The guests were few, an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Gable, smiling through happy tears, Julian's loyal security head, Henderson, standing proudly, and a few other close friends who had seen their journey unfold. Elara wore a simple white dress, her face radiant. Julian stood beside her, his hand holding hers, his eyes never leaving her face. Their vows were simple, heartfelt promises whispered in the quiet of the afternoon. But the most important part of the ceremony came from the boys. As the rings were exchanged, Leo Vance stepped forward. He held out a small, intricately woven bracelet made of colorful threads. He gently slipped it onto Elara's wrist. It was a perfect match to the one she had made for him weeks ago. "Now you have one too, Mom," he said, the word Mom sounding as natural as breathing. Then Elara's son, her brave Leo, stepped up to Julian. He wasn't holding a bracelet. He was holding a small, framed picture. It was the crayon drawing of the airplane, the first fragile bridge between their two worlds, now preserved forever behind glass. Julian accepted it with a reverence usually reserved for a priceless piece of art. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And in that moment, under the warm sun, surrounded by the scent of roses, they were no longer two broken halves. They were a family, whole, complete. Later, as the day softened into evening, the four of them walked hand in hand through the garden. Their laughter was a gentle, happy sound that filled the air. Julian looked at Elara, at the woman who had returned his wallet when she had nothing, and in doing so, had given him everything. She caught his eye and smiled, a smile of pure love and profound peace. She was no longer defined by her scars, but by the love that had healed them. Because sometimes the most broken pieces, when brought together by kindness, are not just repaired. They are used to build something more beautiful, and far stronger than what was there before.